On the Enterprise, we meet Lieutenant Valeris, played by Kim Cattrall. Valeris is a replacement for Saavik in the story, as is rather obvious again if you look back-to-back in the manner that I mentioned before. This script, because it exposes the darker side of the Federation as well as the Klingons, caused a great deal of tension. Brock Peters had a difficult time saying some of his bigoted dialogue about Klingons. Shatner was unhappy with the cut of the "let them die" scene because he wanted it to be more obvious that Kirk didn't harbor extreme hatred. One of Uhura's lines was given to Chekhov when Nichelle Nichols flat out refused to say it. So it's no surprise that when Kirstie Alley was approached to bring Saavik back in this role, she turned it down, not believing that her character could act that way. Myers was persuaded enough not to recast the part, but to change it to Valeris, though it could be argued that the events to come would have maybe had a bit more of an emotional impact if it had been Saavik and not Valeris in the role. However, this can be forgiven because Valeris is hot. Kirk makes a confession in his personal log.
Captain's log, stardate 9522.6. I've never trusted Klingons, and I never will. I can never forgive them for the death of my boy. But how on earth can history get past people like me?
After a brief interruption, we soon see her talking with Spock. She's clearly frightened at the prospect of change in this way, but as a Vulcan, the emotion is not sufficiently presented to be noticeable. As a result, Spock's response is a bit dismissive, that it'll all work out somehow, and when she asks whether that's logical, makes his well-known comment that logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. The scene works quite well in that, when viewed originally, it's that the scene is about Spock, when really it's a scene about Valeris, which is only visible in retrospect. But Spock brushes aside her concerns, as he wants to tell her that she is the perfect person to replace him as first officer, says the guy in his bathrobe drinking a giant chalice of booze. Kronos 1, a Klingon battlecruiser, soon arrives, wearing the awe-inspiring gigantic starship sombrero. Kirk's almost frozen at the sight of it, something he's learned all his life to be ready to fight, and even Chekhov asks if they should raise shields. Kirk finally sends their signal, and this is where we finally meet Gorkon, played by David Warner, who, while having few lines, still delivers a great performance. The Klingons of Star Trek VI irked Gene Roddenberry for precisely the reason I think they're great. They're not the TNG Klingons. Now, I realize there are a significant number of Trekkies who adore the TNG Klingons. I've even received a death threat by someone who emulates the Klingon ways, so I may be in danger with that sentiment. Luckily, just as surely as scissors loses to rock and paper loses to scissors, batleth loses to baseball bat, especially when your opponent is not above a swing towards praxis to take advantage of their insufficient safety measures. Anyway, the Klingons shift later in TNG, when it went from being great warriors to being all about being a warrior to total cultural obsession over being a warrior. It got to be too much. They became space Vikings, and in my opinion, a stereotype. Here we see the opposite of that. These Klingons are not above physical violence. Even Gorkon looks like he might be able to use that tusk he has on his person as a weapon if he thinks it's necessary. But being a warrior doesn't confine them. They seem less like Vikings and more like samurai, especially Christopher Plummer's General Chang, who is a cultured warrior. In 3 minutes, he has more depth to him than most Klingons later on would have in an entire episode. Chang himself also has such a memorable appearance, with his shaved head, save for a ponytail, and that bolted-on eye patch. Yet he doesn't come across as a hostile enemy. He comes across as a deadly one. But let's not let that stand between this crew and a chance to have a meal, which they certainly seem to enjoy quite often. And, this humpback is just delightful. Glad we saved some for this special occasion. This is where the title comes in. Actually, The Undiscovered Country was supposed to be the title of Star Trek II, since the reference in Hamlet is to that which is beyond death, which is what happens to Spock. This time it is used to reference the future, and it's at this point where the Klingons start getting under Kirk's skin by claiming that Shakespeare was originally Klingon. He starts downing one glass of Romulan ale after another until his diplomacy skills get a bit pickled, and some of the needlessly confrontational Klingon remarks finally pushes him too far.
The Federation is no more than a Homo sapiens only club.
Present company accepted, of course.
Well, thanks for leaping to the Federation's defense, Spock.
I see we have a long way to go.
With the meal a disaster, Kirk's eventually called to the bridge because of a bizarre neutron radiation surge, which no one's happy to deal with, given all the Romulan ale they've had. I think I crapped mold before. That can't be normal. Out of nowhere, a torpedo gets fired and hits Kronos 1, and everyone's shocked that somehow they fired on the Klingons. Another shot and their gravity's disabled. 2 men in Starfleet pressure suits then beam over and attack. Kirk tries to send them a message, though it seems unlikely the Klingons would buy it, and it probably would just get messed up like everything else along the way. With the Klingons helpless in zero-G, there's nothing stopping the assassination of Gorkon, bleeding huge amounts of Pepto-Bismol. Chang threatens to destroy them, and although Scotty insists they haven't fired, Spock says the computer says that they have. Kirk surrenders to avoid a confrontation, and he and McCoy head over to try to work something out. Chang is incredulous, but with no surgeon available, McCoy tries to save him. All he succeeds in doing, though, is performing cardioplot resuscitation. You know, where the person's returned to consciousness only long enough to deliver a certain message and then die. Happens all the time in fiction. Gorkon tells Kirk not to let the peace process end this way, and then he dies. Kirk and Bones are arrested for the assassination.
I assume command of the ship as of 0230 hours.
It's mine! 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 As they await instructions, they have one subplot they must sort out, unraveling the mystery of whether or not they fired, and who was it that really killed Gorkon. Meanwhile, things are heated up with the Klingon ambassador from Star Trek IV demanding Kirk and McCoy be tried on Kronos for their crimes. The president, incidentally, is the dad from that 70s show, a fact that's hard to ignore even with all that makeup. Still, he manages not to tell the ambassador to kiss his ass, but after he departs, Starfleet comes up with their rescue plan, delivered by Colonel West. No doubt a reference to Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North from the Iran-Contra scandal, which probably only means something to most of you as a name tied to a Konami video game. Shatner actually played Colonel North on Saturday Night Live the same night when he did that Get a Life sketch. Anyway, getting back to the film. Naturally, plotting to insert forces onto the homeworld of a sovereign nation is not the kind of thing you need to worry about keeping secret, so the Romulan ambassador is kept around to watch the whole thing. The president turns down the rescue plan to avoid starting a war. Likewise, the Klingons are pushing the new chancellor to go to war against the Federation, and she refuses, despite prompting from Chang. In the Klingon justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups. General Chang, who arrests and prosecutes, and a bunch of guys who bang pointy sticks. These, God help us all, are their stories. Yes, Kirk and McCoy are put on trial, with the Skeksis presiding over it and an ancestor of Worf defending them. That's grim news, Kirk, considering Worf's reputation for getting his ass kicked. Sure enough, Chang plays up McCoy's failure to save Gorkon and Kirk's hatred of Klingons, including playing the excerpt from his personal log saying he's never trusted them because of what happened to his son. Chang also delivers a little Adlai Stevenson.
Do you deny being demoted for these charges? Don't wait for the translation! Answer me now!
Kirk and McCoy are found guilty and sentenced to the mines of Urapente. Urapente is located in a harsh, brutal, unrelenting frozen wasteland that seeks to crush the spirits of all who live there. It's exactly what it's like going to school in Minnesota. The warden meets them out in the snow, telling them that there's no escape, and also trying to impress them with the superior sturdy construction of Klingon boxes by standing on top of one. Inside, Kirk gets accosted by this Luxon who wants his coat, but Martia intervenes, telling them that there's a price on their heads, even here. Meanwhile, Sulu orders the Excelsior to contact Enterprise and let them know that they're standing by if they need assistance. It's been 2 months, but they're still hanging around out here in case any other cool stuff blows up. They're still looking over the scenes of the attack, since all torpedoes have been visually accounted for. Scotty insists that they couldn't have fired, causing Spock's remark.
An ancestor of mine maintained that if you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
The joke being that Spock is a descendant of Sherlock Holmes. On his mother's side, of course. Nick Myers has actually written a few Sherlock Holmes stories, so he would know. He concludes that the Klingons must have had a bird of prey that could fire while cloaked, which is what gave off that neutron radiation. Still, someone had to have falsified the computer records, so Spock has the ship searched for the gravity boots used by the assassins, and a slave girl costume for Valeris to wear. Well, not really, but I can dream, can't I? These scenes, incidentally, help to illustrate why this trek is back on the right path, as the characters are all playing to their strengths. Spock is the calm, logical leader, puzzling through the mystery bit by bit, eternally patient. Kirk is in the thick of things, fighting, scheming, staying ahead of his adversaries through cunning, prowess, and force of will. Bones is along for the ride, but continuing his role of cantankerous observer. And for the rest, they played their appropriate roles of support, but having their occasional moments like Scotty's rant about the bird of prey and the realism of their situation, or Uhura's handling of the comm unit in Klingon. Sulu has also slipped easily into the role of command. While he is still ready to defer to his old superiors, he nevertheless handles his own ship with the manner of a seasoned leader. Given the film's position as the final one for the original crew, it helps elevate the clever yet subtly amusing script to the level needed for the final send-off that it is. While the Enterprise crew searches for the boots, speculation arises as to what might have happened to them. Chekhov considers vaporizing them, but Valeris demonstrates why that'd be impractical by shooting a pot and setting off the alarms. Effective, but dangerous, for it has brought down Uhura, accompanied by Thrust Barcode's League of G-Men, who are itching for a fight ever since their leader headed off for Klingon space alone with his rocket pack and moon laser to try to rescue Kirk and McCoy. It would have been enough, too, if it weren't for that ambush by Broken Umbrella Pimp and Wicker Supersize. Spock surmises that Kirk is already working on his escape plan, although it's kind of dropped in his lap when Martia says that she can lead them out if they'll take her with them.
Are you afraid of the future?
I believe that was a general idea that I was trying to convey.
I don't mean this future.
What is this? Multiple choice?
What Kirk's revealing is the reason for his outburst of let them die, the reason for his reaction to all of this news really, even with Gorkon's personal discussion. That he was so blinded by the years he'd spent hating Klingons that it never occurred to him that Gorkon might be telling the truth. He feared what this future might be, which, as we will discuss in our final part, is the reason this film is called The Undiscovered Country.